welcome back to another edition of Meet the Solutionaries on Green TV. And I'm going to welcome back someone I'm so pleased to know, going way back. I think of him as sort of our resident climate scientist, Dr. Michael Mann. You probably know him because he does make himself available to the media. That's something I know everyone appreciates. I certainly appreciate it as someone who does independent green media, but as you know, someone who's been at it a long time. So thanks for making time on what's a very busy week between the IPCC report coming out. Chilling is the only word that comes to mind. But last week you co-authored an article that had some good news. And I should mention that your most recent book, as you just said, you're working on a sixth. So the fifth is the one that you've gotten a lot of attention for. It's right there behind you, of course, the new climate war, because I want to ask you later in the interview about a White House gathering that happened that was all about climate denialism and delayism. So now that I've set the scene, tell us how you're feeling. You always smile, you always have good news, but come on, the latest, even I had to really stop and take a few deep breaths and have a drink, frankly.
Yeah, hi, Betsy. Well, it's great to be with you. And, it was a sobering report. Of course, the reality is that these reports don't come as a surprise. The contents of these reports don't come as a surprise to those of us who work in the field because they're based on the published scientific literature. So we sort of know what they're going to say, but nonetheless, they are an extremely important opportunity for us to communicate what we know collectively to the public. And the message, undeniably is a dire one. We're seeing dangerous climate change impacts play out in real time now. There's no denying that. And so at this point, it's really a question of how bad are we willing to let it get? And I think the report lays bare that choice for us.
In August, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who never minces words, said code red for climate. And that is, something that is hard to forget. And then this time, an equally dramatic quote: "Delay is deadly."
Yeah, I mean, and he's being literal there. There are more people dying collectively from the devastating consequences of climate change than there are people dying from COVID. In the long term, it is a far deadlier crisis that we face in the climate crisis. And so the statement, while it might sound like hyperbole, is quite literally true. People are now losing their lives due to the devastating consequences of climate change, inundation, unprecedented wildfires and heat waves. You know the litany. We've seen the scenes on our televisions.
And the flooding in Australia, where I know you spent your sabbatical when it was on
a year after the devastating bushfires that spread across that continent. Yep.
And then the mudslide in Brazil recently. I mean, just every week there's something around the world. We've recently been lucky enough to spend some time in the Bahamas, and in Freeport, one of the islands, they had just now gotten back their fresh water. They had brackish water since Hurricane Dorian hit in fall of 2019, I think. The beaches are getting smaller, because of sea level rise. It's evident everywhere. And it feels like we have gone from the proverbial problem, what problem, to, oh yeah, it's too late. But you are one of the strongest speakers on the fact that it's not too late, that we do have time. But I feel like it's, with the window is closing still even more. So you're so optimistic normally. This report is just devastating. It really is. And you don't want people to feel like it's too late. So you did this article. I'd like to hear about what you discovered or realized about how long our emissions actually stay in the atmosphere. And if we could somehow go to stop emitting tomorrow, which isn't going to happen, that it would take perhaps 3 to 5 years for things to turn around, not 30 to forever years.
Yeah, so, the science isn't actually that new. It's more than a decade old. When we talk about carbon budgets, when we talk about how much carbon is there left that we can burn and still keep global temperatures below, say, 1.5 degrees Celsius, 3 degrees Fahrenheit. Implicit in the concept of a carbon budget is the fact that the warming that we get, to a very good approximation, is only a consequence of the cumulative emissions up to this point in time. So a corollary of that, and that's what we were really talking about in the article, is that if you stop emitting carbon, surface temperatures stabilize very quickly within a few years. So that is actually a consequence of science that's been known for more than a decade. But what we haven't done, in my view, in part as scientists seeking to communicate the science to the public, is to connect the dots, that this concept of a carbon budget now, it renders outdated this concept that we used to communicate that the planet would continue to warm up for decades, even after we stopped emitting carbon. What we realized when we did more elaborate experiments where we didn't treat carbon dioxide as a control knob, because that's not what it is. Instead, we're putting carbon into the atmosphere, but the oceans, the plants determine what happens to much of that carbon. They've been taking up about half of that carbon. And so when you stop burning fossil fuels, then the oceans and the plants start taking it back out of the atmosphere. The CO2 levels start to come down. And the net effect is that you're sort of you reach a plateau fairly quickly. So that's the good news. It's why we know that if we reduce carbon emissions by 50% this decade and bring them to zero by the middle of this century, that we can still avert a catastrophic warming of 1.5 Celsius, 3 Fahrenheit. So there's the urgency, and this report lays bare the urgency. But there's also this agency, as I like to say, that we can have a direct impact on the climate by acting now. But that requires action, right? The obstacles aren't technological at this point. They're entirely political.
And yet we have Build Back Better stalled seemingly forever, which is hard to believe. We have the U.S. Postal Service, because of one of Trump's appointments, deciding not to electrify the fleet of trucks that stop and go all over streets in America. It doesn't feel like, at the top levels, they're getting it at all. And even just young people are so discouraged. So was this bit of good news in the latest IPCC report just hidden, and you're trying to bring it forth? Because this is very important, because I, like you everywhere, run across people who just say, we're screwed. And it's like, these are parents, they're grandparents. How can we just write off the future? Hello, shouldn't we be doing everything we can? What would that look like if the government was doing everything they could, the media was doing everything they could, activists do everything they can, but they alone can't save it, especially the planet, the future, humanity. There aren't enough of us.
Yeah, in that parallel universe, what would things look like? Where we did pass Build Back Better, where the United States stepped up, committed to lowering its carbon emissions by 50% this decade, bringing the rest of the world to the table. That's still a possible path. And, we can't give up now. We're stymied right now by our fraught politics, and the fact that there are even two Democrats, it turns out, who are standing in the way of passing Build Back Better, and with those climate provisions that we need to make good on our commitments to the rest of the world. So
Democrats, they don't vote like Democrats traditionally.
Well, no, they don't.
Really, that's an understatement. And how maddening.
That's why a narrow majority doesn't work. We've got to turn out in droves so that we have huge Democratic majorities in Congress. That's the only way that we're going to see this sort of action.
And while we always talk about Manchin and Sinema, what about the Republicans?
Yeah, I know. We let them off the hook by focusing so much on.
We've lowered our expectations so low to the ground that we just say, oh yeah, we know they're going to be that way. But what the heck? I mean,
but we've lowered our expectations that only one of the two major parties now believes in democracy.
That's another thing. So the collapse of the climate and democracy, and now we have war breaking out in Ukraine. And I did not see your face all over the news yesterday. I do monitor when these big reports come out, go back and forth between CNN in one room, MSNBC in the other, because news of the war in Ukraine is so big. The problem is that the newsrooms then don't go back and say, oh, we didn't really cover that.
Right.
It just doesn't happen. They go on to the next thing. And that is a problem, because even though they've gotten better, it's not a main beat that gets covered, on a regular basis. And that's why we have Green TV, of course. But how important at this very late date with this, narrow window to act ACT, capital ACT, exclamation. It's almost like each time it's like, really, no, really.
Right.
And are people getting that message?
Right.
I don't see enough of it. I'm sure you don't either. So what newly has to change? Because I know you say we need to vote. We have agency. But what would you like to see going forward that maybe you haven't even been calling for in the past? Because of course we can only vote every few years.
Yeah, I mean, it really is the same battle. The battle to preserve democracy, and certainly our democracy here in the United States, is the essential battle. It's the defining battle of our time, because without a functioning democracy, we're not going to be able to pass meaningful climate legislation. And so we have to recognize that these larger imminent threats that we face right now with our democracy and with global democracy have huge implications for our ability to address the climate crisis. And moreover, we have to understand that the underlying factors behind this latest conflict, Russia's aggression towards Ukraine, is driven by fossil fuels. That is their number one export. That is what drives the Russian economy, and it's why they've been able to hold other Western countries,
Hostage.
hostage. Exactly.
And it's not the first time we've seen wars break out over oil.
Absolutely. In the Middle East, in this Russian aggression, it's all about oil. And if we stop, if we get off fossil fuels, if we transition as rapidly as we need to renewable energy, then that has huge implications for global security. It means we're no longer forced to purchase fossil fuels from hostile foreign powers or to engage in conflicts aimed at preserving our access to oil and natural gas. And so the answer to all of these crises is the same. We've got to get off fossil fuels.
Got to get off our gases, wake up and smell the carbon, as I say. So oil doesn't have us over a barrel, pun maybe intended, but not funny at all, because
no,
I couldn't think of a stereo scenario than what we're seeing right now. I mean, a guy who's got his finger on, it's almost like Trump, the Russian version, because
that's right.
Deranged, megalomaniac, demagogue, and
right.
Even worse than he was. Apparently he got isolated during the pandemic. Well, some of us, just got sad. He got mad. I mean, mad isn't crazy or crazier. Yeah. And yet our hands are tied, really. All countries that rely on Russian oil. And I don't know how many that is, you may know, but it's a dangerous moment, isn't it?
Yeah, but there's an opportunity here as well, because we can recognize, and I think it's so obvious, how Russia was able to hold much of Western Europe, the United States, other countries hostage because of our reliance on their oil and their gas. It's become, I think, obvious that we have to get off fossil fuels. And so if anything good comes out of this, I think a number of good things could come out of this. It's the rest of the world seems to be coming together to support democracy against autocracy, and against democracy against aggression, and maybe it's a reckoning. It's a moment for a reckoning about our continued reliance, our dangerous continued reliance on fossil fuels.
Let's hope so. But I remember saying the same thing about the pandemic, and we seem to be coming out of that. And I'm not sure that the message that this is related to how we interact with nature. And, as Dr. Peter Daszak said of EcoHealth Alliance, as long as we have a sick planet, we're going to have sicker people. And
That's right.
It's all connected. And I hope that that is a message that we can get out there, because it just
absolutely
doesn't normally in corporate media, unfortunately. And we're not going to talk too much about that in particular, but I do want to hear about a meeting that was held at the White House last week, because it was really about denialism and delayism. Yeah. And I wonder who thought of that. And I would imagine you were the first person on the invite list, unless you were the one who organized it. So important. I would have loved to have been there, either as a participant, because I'm obsessed with this issue, and or a fly on the wall. So what can you tell us about it? Yeah,
well, I was happy to see it come together. It actually was an outgrowth of a conversation that I'd had with a former OSTP director who's no longer there. So that I was afraid that when that individual had to step down for good reasons, frankly, that this effort would get lost, that it wouldn't come to fruition, but it did. OSTP stuck with it. They brought together a couple dozen leading scientists, climate scientists, and climate science communicators. It would have been great to have you there.
Well, I'm writing a book on it, literally.
Yeah, it's not nearly as many people as I would have liked to see brought to the table. There were some very important voices that were missing, which is always the case when you're trying to limit it to a relatively small number of individuals. But nonetheless,
on the list, because I got a lot.
We'll do that.
Monitoring Fox and Hannity and torturing myself just to see how they're still actively denying and downplaying.
Absolutely. So yeah, it was a good conversation. It was a frank conversation about what we're talking about, that we're not going to solve this problem without taking on the bad actors who continue to promote, if not denial, because it's impossible to deny climate change now. This is the thesis of my recent book, The New Climate War, that it's impossible to deny that it's happening. So instead, what we've seen is the bad actors, the polluters, hostile state actors like Russia, Saudi Arabia, instead resort to other tactics, to delay action, to deflect attention away from the needed policies, to divide us using, weaponizing online social media to divide climate advocates, getting them fighting with each other, and so on. So we have to recognize these tactics that they are using, and we need to defend against them. And that's really the message of my recent book.
So it's not just industry and some corporate actors, but it's also the media. Right-wing media hosts have been screaming.
The Murdoch media is a cancer on our body politic, and we're not going to fix these problems without addressing that.
So was that a big part of the discussion? I hope so, because if not everybody watches Fox to know that they're still lying about it and making it into a tree hugger issue, and ironically calling, when I've been on in the past, calling them a socialist, and they're loving Putin. Like, there's a disconnect there that we certainly won't go into now. But I'm just curious, was that at least part of the discussion, how the disinformation campaign, which they got called out for on COVID, what about climate, which has been happening for about 2 decades that I've been watching it?
Yeah, I mean, if not by name, and I can't remember if, sometimes we don't even have to say Fox News or Murdoch. Everybody knows who
Sean Hannity we're talking about. Tucker Carlson, now that Rush Limbaugh is gone.
Right.
Right. They're really big purveyors of this.
Yeah, and Fox News and the entire Murdoch, global media network, the editorial pages of the Wall Street Journal, the New York Post, many of the newspapers in the UK and Australia, many of the news networks in Australia, Foxtel network. It's this pervasive disinformation machine that needs to be dismantled.
Absolutely, because it's no mystery when you look at all these outlets, and Fox is still the #1 news, quote, not a news but network that pretends to be news. It's got still millions of Americans watching it. Not only are they, and
they've been poisoned by it, perhaps irrevocably poisoned, their minds poisoned by the massive onslaught of misinformation and disinformation.
And being anti-Biden, like they were anti-Obama at any cost, future be damned, children, grandchildren.
Even if it means siding with Vladimir Putin.
WTF is all I can
say. So
is
the operative acronym today.
Were there any these days? Was there any action steps that you came out of it with, in particular in regards to media? Because we keep saying it's terrible, it's got to be stopped. How can they get away with it and get paid handsomely to lie and actively disinform the public when it is life and death?
Yeah, I mean, we sort of know what needs to be done, but the only way we're going to do it is by, through more political power. We need the political might to take on this corrupt juggernaut, which is today's Republican Party and its alliance with bad foreign actors and right-wing media outlets who are seeking to poison the minds of the electorate. This is a war. There's a reason that I use that framing, the new climate war. We are in a war with bad actors, with villains. And just like the war that we're seeing right now between Russia and Ukraine, it's a very clear battle between good and evil.
It's tragic and it's unnecessary and it has to stop. And you talk about if the answer is with the politicians, God help us. But if it's so important to vote for candidates who believe science and are proactive on climate and oceans, and it's not just climate, of course, extinction, they're all connected, but they're all worthy of their own focus. Then we're going to be stuck where we are now with Build Back Better. And that's why the media has got to do a much better job, and more people have to watch Green TV to have the dots connected. Truly, it's not just a shameless plug. We are connecting those dots that need to happen so that people vote for, but regardless of their party, regardless of their voting history, vote for people who are talking about this with urgency. We can't afford another 2 years or God forbid 4 years of this. So, any parting thoughts now that we've covered the good, bad, and ugly?
Well, I think, we know what the challenge is. We've got to vote, but we've got to turn out the vote. We've got to make sure everybody we know votes, not just in these presidential elections, but in the off-term and midterm elections. Because if we don't turn out and vote in those elections, Republicans have figured out how to weaponize those lower turnout elections to get in place their lackeys, their mouthpieces, those who are willing to do their bidding, and we're increasingly losing, control even at the local level of our politics to bad actors who are part of this, this right-wing movement that is, today's Republican Party. And so we've got to turn out massively. We've got to make sure everybody we know who can vote does vote, help them, and do everything we can to win back our government for the side of frankly, for the side of good.
Well, I know you've got to go and I've got to go vote. I live in Austin and I'm going to go cast a ballot for better or
Oh,
worse.
yes. Congratulations. Yes.
Oh my God, Greg Abbott, when I was here for the snowpocalypse, declared like on day 1.5, oh, it's the solar and wind, generator's fault. I'm like, what? Talk about WTF,
Yeah, to his credit, he didn't fly off to Cancun and leave behind his citizens. I guess he couldn't get a ticket at that point. But
Ed Cruz is my senator. We're here hopefully to be part of the blue and greening of Texas, but not fast enough. Thanks so much. I want to say Michael, but Dr. Michael Mann, who is a great author, a great media spokesperson, a great optimist in the face of really, really dire news. So really appreciate you taking time. I know you're busy. I hope to see you on some of the networks in the days to come once, well, I'm not sure things are going to settle down in the Ukraine, but get the message out. It's all about oil. It's about our addiction to fossil fuels. Remember, George Bush talked about our addiction to
That's right. He used those very words.
How many decades ago? So the Republican Party's got to go. I'm sorry, the dinosaurs got to die. Or we're all going to. Thanks.
Well, no, sadly, that's the state of affairs where one of our two parties doesn't even support democracy. So the choice is clear now. We just have to go and make it. Always good talking with you, Betsy.
Thank you. We need to call it out louder and more often and in places where there's still millions of people, watching.